December 3rd, 2024, at 10:30 p.m., South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol appeared on national television with an announcement that shocked the nation. "I declare emergency martial law," he said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying something darker. Within minutes, troops were deployed. Helicopters descended on the National Assembly. Armed soldiers stormed the building. Opposition lawmakers were to be arrested. Political activities were banned. The press was to be controlled. And democracy, as South Koreans had known it for nearly 4 decades, appeared to be ending in real time. But 6 hours later, it was over. Parliament voted down the decree. Citizens surrounded the National Assembly, blocking military vehicles with their bodies, and Yoon, facing a nation that refused to submit, lifted martial law. The world called it a victory for democracy, a triumph of civic resistance, a shining example of how ordinary people can stop authoritarianism. And it was all of those things. But what the world didn't know then, what investigators are only now revealing, is that December 3rd wasn't a panicked response to political pressure. It wasn't a desperate gamble by a president losing control. It was the culmination of a conspiracy that had been brewing for over a year. A conspiracy that involved provoking North Korea into military action, fabricating evidence of electoral fraud, planning the detention of 500 political opponents, and attempting to abolish presidential term limits so Yoon could rule indefinitely. This is the story of how a democratically elected president spent a year planning a coup against his own country, how he tried to manufacture a war to justify dictatorship, how he came within hours of succeeding, and how ordinary citizens, armed with nothing but smartphones and the refusal to be silent, stopped him. This is the story of South Korea's secret coup, and it's a warning about how fragile democracy really is. The first clue that something was wrong came in October 2024, 2 months before martial law, a strange incident that didn't make much sense at the time but now looks like the opening move in Yoon's plan. On October 10th, North Korean state media issued an angry statement. Drones had been spotted over Pyongyang, the capital. South Korean drones, flying deep into North Korean airspace, dropping propaganda leaflets over government buildings. It was a violation of the armistice, a provocation, and North Korea promised retaliation. At the time, South Korea's Ministry of Defense denied involvement. They said they had no information about any drone operations. The military claimed it wasn't them. And most analysts assumed it was activists, the kind of defector groups that occasionally send balloons across the border with anti-regime messages. North Korea threatened consequences but ultimately did nothing. The incident faded from the news. But now, investigators have confirmed what many suspected. The drones were South Korean military assets, and the operation was ordered directly by President Yoon Suk Yeol. Why would a president order a covert military operation into hostile territory without telling anyone? The answer, according to prosecutors, is chilling. Yoon wanted North Korea to retaliate. He wanted them to respond with force, a missile strike, an artillery barrage, something that would allow him to declare a national emergency, mobilize the military, and impose martial law under the guise of protecting national security. It was a plan to manufacture a crisis, to create the conditions for a power grab by provoking the enemy. And if North Korea had responded the way Yoon hoped, the December 3rd martial law declaration would have looked justified. The public would have supported it. Opposition lawmakers would have had no choice but to comply. And Yoon would have had the legal cover to consolidate power. But North Korea didn't take the bait. Pyongyang issued threats but no military action. And Yoon was left without the external crisis he needed, so he pivoted. If he couldn't create a war, he would create a different kind of emergency, one based on internal threats, electoral fraud, legislative dictatorship, anti state forces, terms that would justify martial law even without North Korean aggression. The planning for this backup strategy began even earlier. In October 2023, more than a year before martial law, investigators found a notebook belonging to Major General Ro Sang-won, a former head of the Defense Intelligence Command and a key member of Yoon's inner circle. The notebook, recovered during a police raid in February 2025, contained detailed plans, not vague ideas, not contingencies, specific operational plans for suspending the National Assembly, replacing it with an emergency legislative body controlled by Yoon, detaining approximately 500 public figures, politicians, journalists, activists, labor leaders, people who had criticized Yoon or opposed his policies. And most disturbingly, abolishing presidential term limits to allow Yoon to serve 3 terms instead of one. This wasn't a hypothetical exercise. This was a coup blueprint, and Yoon, according to prosecutors, was directly involved in its creation. The notebook included meeting notes, dates, names, logistics. It referenced discussions Yoon had with military commanders about how martial law would be implemented, which units would be deployed, which buildings would be secured, how opposition lawmakers would be detained. It even outlined plans for controlling the media, shutting down critical news outlets, censoring social media, managing the narrative to prevent public resistance. Prosecutors allege that Yoon began actively preparing for this coup in late 2023, shortly after his ruling party lost the April 2024 general election. That election was a disaster for Yoon. The opposition Democratic Party, led by Lee Jae-myung, secured a supermajority in the National Assembly. Yoon's ability to govern was effectively neutered. Every bill he proposed could be blocked. Every appointee he nominated could be rejected. And the opposition began investigating corruption allegations against Yoon's administration, his wife, and his closest advisors. Impeachment wasn't a distant threat, it was a real possibility. And Yoon, facing political irrelevance and potential prosecution, decided that the only way to survive was to eliminate the opposition entirely. According to the notebook and witness testimony from military officials who have since cooperated with investigators, Yoon's plan evolved through several stages. First, provoke North Korea to create a national security crisis. When that failed, shift to framing the April 2024 election as fraudulent. Claim that anti state forces had manipulated the results. Use this narrative to justify investigating, arresting, and neutralizing opposition leaders. And finally, when political and legal pressure became unbearable, declare martial law, not as a temporary emergency measure, but as the first step in permanently dismantling democratic institutions and consolidating authoritarian rule. The April 2024 election fraud narrative was key to this strategy. After his party's crushing defeat, Yoon and his allies began publicly questioning the integrity of the election. They claimed without evidence that the electronic voting system had been hacked, that opposition activists had manipulated ballots, that foreign interference had tilted the results. Independent observers, election monitors, and even members of Yoon's own party acknowledged that the election was free and fair. The results weren't close. The opposition won decisively. But Yoon and his inner circle continued to push the fraud narrative, not because they believed it, but because they needed it. If the election was fraudulent, then the opposition's control of the National Assembly was illegitimate, And if the opposition was illegitimate, then Yoon had a justification for bypassing, suspending, or dissolving the legislature. By late 2024, the situation had become untenable. The opposition was moving forward with investigations into Yoon's wife, Kim Keon-hee, over allegations of stock manipulation and influence peddling. They were scrutinizing Yoon's appointments. They were blocking his legislative agenda. Impeachment resolutions were being discussed openly. And Yoon, cornered and desperate, made the decision to act. On December 1st, 2 days before the martial law declaration, military commanders at the colonel level were suddenly called to a meeting. They were told to prepare for an imminent provocation by North Korea. Defense Counterintelligence Command Leader Yeol In-hyung issued orders to be ready for what he called a serious North Korean filth balloon situation, a reference to the trash-filled balloons North Korea occasionally floats into South Korean airspace as propaganda. But this wasn't about balloons. This was the final phase of Yoon's plan, creating a sense of urgency, priming the military for action, and setting the stage for the declaration that would come 48 hours later. On December 3rd at 10:30 p.m., Yoon appeared on television. He declared martial law. He accused the opposition of being anti-state forces engaged in legislative dictatorship. He claimed they were sympathetic to North Korea, that they were undermining national security, that emergency measures were necessary to protect the country. It was a speech designed to sound reasonable, measured, patriotic. But the actions that followed revealed the truth. Within minutes, 1,580 troops were deployed. 107 military vehicles rolled through Seoul. 12 Black Hawk helicopters took to the skies. And over 9,000 rounds of live ammunition were distributed. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. This was an armed occupation. Troops surrounded the National Assembly. Special Forces units attempted to storm the building. Their orders were clear: prevent lawmakers from entering. If they were already inside, prevent them from voting. And if they voted anyway, detain them. The goal was to stop the National Assembly from exercising its constitutional power to lift martial law, because under South Korean law, if the National Assembly votes to reject a martial law declaration, the president must comply. Yoon's entire plan depended on preventing that vote. But he underestimated the opposition, and he underestimated the people. As news of the martial law declaration spread, lawmakers rushed to the National Assembly. Some climbed over fences. Others were smuggled in through side entrances. Opposition leader Lee Jae-myung live-streamed his journey, urging citizens to converge on the building. And they did. Thousands of people, many of them young, armed with nothing but smartphones and light sticks from K-pop concerts, surrounded the National Assembly. They formed human barricades. They blocked military vehicles. They chanted, sang, and refused to move. Inside, lawmakers from both parties, including members of Yoon's own People Power Party, gathered in the chamber. At 1 a.m., just over 2 hours after martial law was declared, the National Assembly voted. 190 lawmakers out of 300 were present. All 190 voted to reject martial law. It was unanimous. Every single lawmaker, regardless of party, said no. Under the Constitution, Yoon had no choice. The vote was binding. And at 4:27 a.m., after frantic discussions with his cabinet and military commanders, Yoon appeared on television again. He announced that he would lift martial law. Troops were withdrawn. The crisis, at least the immediate one, was over. But the fallout was just beginning. Within days, the National Assembly moved to impeach Yoon. The first vote, held on December 7th, failed because members of Yoon's party boycotted it, preventing a quorum. But public pressure was immense. Protests erupted across the country. Millions took to the streets, demanding accountability. And on December 14th, a second impeachment vote was held. This time, enough lawmakers from Yoon's own party broke ranks. The vote passed with more than two-thirds support. Yoon was suspended from office. Prime Minister Han Duck-soo became acting president. But the crisis wasn't over. Han himself was accused of being complicit in the martial law plot. On December 27th, just 2 weeks after Yoon's impeachment, the National Assembly impeached Han as well. Finance Minister Choi Sang-mok became acting president. South Korea, one of the world's most stable democracies, was in constitutional chaos. And then, on January 15, 2025, something unprecedented happened. Police arrested Yoon Suk-yeol. He became the first sitting president in South Korean history to be taken into custody. He was indicted on charges of leading an insurrection. Prosecutors argued that his martial law declaration wasn't a legitimate use of executive power. It was an attempt to overthrow the constitutional order. And under South Korean law, that's insurrection, a crime punishable by death or life imprisonment. The trial that followed has been one of the most significant in South Korean history, not just because of what Yoon is accused of, but because of what the evidence has revealed. Prosecutors have presented testimony from dozens of military officers, government officials, and members of Yoon's inner circle. They've introduced documents, notebooks, phone records, and meeting notes that paint a picture of a conspiracy far more extensive than anyone initially realized. In March 2025, the Constitutional Court, which had been reviewing Yoon's impeachment, issued a preliminary ruling. They reinstated Han Duck-soo as acting president, overturning his impeachment on procedural grounds. But on April 4th, the court issued its final decision. They unanimously upheld Yoon's impeachment and removal from office. Yoon was no longer president. He was a private citizen awaiting trial on insurrection charges. And now, as of December 2025, the trial is nearing its conclusion. Former Prime Minister Han Duck-soo, accused of aiding Yoon's martial law declaration, faces a verdict on January 21st, 2026. Yoon's own trial is expected to conclude shortly after. Prosecutors are seeking a 15-year prison sentence for Han. For Yoon, they're seeking the maximum penalty. The question isn't just whether Yoon will be convicted. Most legal experts believe the evidence is overwhelming. The question is what sentence he'll receive, and what this all means for South Korean democracy. On December 3rd, 2025, exactly 1 year after the martial law declaration, South Korea held a day of remembrance. President Lee Jae-myung, who had won a special election in July to replace Yoon, gave a speech at the National Assembly. He praised the citizens who had surrounded the building that night. He called their actions a revolution of light. He said South Korea had astonished the world by stopping a self-coup peacefully, and he promised that the legal system would hold everyone involved accountable. But he also acknowledged that the crisis had exposed deep flaws in South Korea's political system, flaws that allowed a president to come so close to overthrowing democracy, flaws that need to be fixed. One of the most disturbing aspects of Yoon's plot, revealed in November 2025, was the extent to which he was willing to risk war to achieve his goals. Prosecutors presented evidence that Yoon's October 2024 drone operation into North Korea wasn't a one-time provocation. It was part of a broader strategy to create border incidents that would justify military mobilization. Major General Roh's notebook included plans for staging attacks along the northern limit line, the disputed maritime border between North and South Korea. The idea was to create ambiguous incidents, attacks that could be blamed on North Korea or defector groups, or even opposition-aligned actors, anything that would create confusion and allow Yoon to declare an emergency. Investigators found that Yoon had discussed these plans with military commanders in closed meetings. He had asked them how far they could push North Korea without triggering full scale war. He wanted incidents that were serious enough to justify martial law but limited enough to avoid a catastrophic conflict. It was a high wire act, playing with fire on one of the most militarized borders in the world. And it nearly worked. If North Korea had responded with force to the October drone incursion, if they had fired missiles or launched artillery, the entire trajectory of the crisis would have been different. Public opinion would have rallied behind Yoon. The opposition would have been forced to support emergency measures, and martial law would have been implemented with broad legitimacy. Yoon could have consolidated power, neutralized his enemies, and entrenched himself as a wartime leader. The fact that it didn't happen was partly luck. North Korea chose restraint, but it was also because of individuals within the South Korean military and intelligence community who refused to go along with Yoon's plans. Officers who leaked information to opposition lawmakers, analysts who raised red flags, people who, when asked to participate in a coup, said no. The role of these internal resistors has been one of the most important revelations of the trials. Prosecutors have granted immunity to several military officers in exchange for testimony, and their accounts have been damning. They describe meetings where Yoon explicitly discussed suspending the Constitution, conversations where he referred to opposition lawmakers as enemies of the state who needed to be eliminated, orders to prepare lists of people to be detained, discussions about how to control the media and suppress dissent. One colonel testified that he was told to prepare a plan for occupying major television stations and forcing them to broadcast only government-approved content. Another described orders to identify and track opposition activists, journalists critical of Yoon, and even academics who had published research questioning Yoon's policies. What emerges from this testimony is a portrait of a president who viewed democracy not as a system to be preserved, but as an obstacle to be overcome. Yoon, according to these witnesses, believed he was acting in South Korea's best interests, that the opposition was controlled by pro-North Korean elements, that the media was biased and corrupt, that the public didn't understand the threats the country faced, and that only he, with unchecked power, could save the nation. It's a mindset that's disturbingly familiar. The same logic that authoritarian leaders throughout history have used to justify dismantling democratic institutions. We're in a crisis. The opposition is disloyal. The press is lying. The people don't know what's good for them. Trust me, give me power. I'll fix everything. It's seductive, especially in times of genuine challenge. And it's dangerous precisely because it sounds reasonable. South Korea in 2024 was facing real problems: economic stagnation, an aging population, tensions with North Korea, a hyper-partisan political environment where compromise seemed impossible. These were legitimate concerns. But Yoon's response wasn't to work within the system. It was to try to destroy the system. And that's the lesson that investigators, legal scholars, and ordinary South Koreans are grappling with now. How do you protect democracy from leaders who are elected democratically, but then use their power to end democracy? South Korea's answer, so far, has been institutional, strengthening checks and balances. In July 2025, the National Assembly passed sweeping reforms to the martial law statute. Under the new law, the president can still declare martial law in genuine emergencies, but the requirements are much stricter. The president must provide detailed justification. The declaration must be reviewed by the courts within 24 hours. And critically, military and police forces are now prohibited from entering the National Assembly compound without the explicit consent of the speaker, even under martial law. That last provision is a direct response to what happened on December 3rd. The attempt to storm the National Assembly was the most shocking moment of the crisis, and lawmakers from across the political spectrum agreed it should never be possible again. But legal reforms can only do so much. The deeper question is cultural. Why did Yoon think he could get away with this? And why did he come so close? Part of the answer lies in South Korea's political polarization. The country has become deeply divided along ideological lines. Yoon's conservative base views the opposition as dangerous radicals. The opposition views Yoon's supporters as authoritarian sympathizers. Social media has amplified these divisions. Echo chambers have hardened, and trust in institutions, the media, the courts, even the electoral system has eroded. Sound familiar? The parallels to other democracies, including the United States, are hard to ignore. The January 6, 2021 attack on the US Capitol and South Korea's December 3rd martial law crisis are different in many ways, but both involved elected leaders or their supporters attempting to prevent democratic institutions from functioning. Both were motivated by a refusal to accept electoral defeat, and both raise fundamental questions about the fragility of democratic norms. In South Korea, these questions are being debated intensely. A poll conducted in November 2025 found that 77% of South Koreans believe political polarization has gotten worse since the martial law crisis. Yoon's People Power Party, now in opposition, has been torn apart by internal divisions. Some members have apologized for Yoon's actions. Others continue to defend him, arguing that martial law was a legitimate response to opposition overreach. The party's base remains loyal to Yoon. Conservative media outlets still frame him as a victim of a political witch hunt, and at rallies outside the courthouse where his trial is being held, supporters wave signs that say "Stop the Steal," echoing language from the United States. It's a reminder that the forces that drove Yoon's coup attempt haven't disappeared. They're still there, waiting. And if South Korea's institutions weaken, if public vigilance fades, they could try again. President Lee Jae-myung has tried to strike a balance. He's vowed strict accountability for everyone involved in the coup plot, but he's also emphasized reconciliation. The intention is not to mercilessly punish the perpetrators, he said in a December 2025 press conference, but to ensure that this never happens again. It's a difficult line to walk. Too much leniency, and you signal that coups are acceptable. Too much punishment, and you risk martyring Yoon and deepening divisions. Lee has proposed a Truth and Reconciliation Commission modeled on South Africa's post-apartheid process. The idea is to have public hearings where everyone involved, from Yoon himself to low-level military officers, can testify about what happened, why it happened, and what they've learned. In exchange for full transparency and cooperation, some participants might receive reduced sentences or immunity. It's a controversial proposal. Victims of the coup attempt, the lawmakers who were threatened, the citizens who were terrified, want justice, not reconciliation. And many legal experts argue that insurrection is too serious a crime to be resolved through restorative or justice. But Lee argues that South Korea needs to understand how this happened if it's going to prevent it from happening again. And that requires getting inside the minds of the people who planned and executed the coup. What were they thinking? How did they justify it to themselves? What warning signs did others miss? These are uncomfortable questions, but they're necessary ones because the truth is that Yoon wasn't a monster. He was a prosecutor who became president. a conservative who believed in law and order, someone who, by most accounts, loved his country. And yet he planned a coup. He tried to start a war. He was willing to imprison hundreds of people and dismantle democracy to stay in power. How does that happen? How does someone go from elected leader to would-be dictator? And how do we stop it from happening to someone else? Those are the questions South Koreans are asking themselves as Yoon's trial nears its end. The verdict, when it comes, will be historic. If Yoon is convicted, he'll be the first former South Korean president to be imprisoned for insurrection. It will be a powerful statement about accountability, but it won't erase the fact that he came terrifyingly close to succeeding. That for 6 hours on December 3rd, 2024, South Korean democracy hung by a thread, and that the only reason it survived was because ordinary citizens, armed with nothing but courage and light sticks, refused to let it die. This is what democracy looks like when it's tested. Not abstract principles, not institutions operating smoothly, but real people making the choice to stand up when everything is on the line. The citizens who surrounded the National Assembly that night didn't know they would win. They didn't know the military wouldn't open fire. They didn't know lawmakers would vote unanimously. They just knew that giving up wasn't an option. And because they refused to give up, democracy survived. For now. The question South Korea and every democracy must answer is, what happens the next time? Because there will be a next time. There always is. Authoritarianism doesn't announce itself with grand declarations. It creeps. It tests boundaries. It exploits crises. And it only succeeds when good people decide that fighting back is too hard, too dangerous, or too late. South Korea's coup plot failed. But it succeeded in revealing something important. Democracy isn't a permanent state. It's a choice that has to be made over and over again by leaders who resist the temptation of unchecked power, by institutions that hold the line even under pressure, and by citizens who show up when it matters most. On December 3rd, 2024, South Koreans made that choice, and the world watched in amazement. But the real test isn't whether they made the right choice once. It's whether they'll keep making it, again and again, for as long as it takes. Because that's what democracy requires. Not perfection, not easy answers, just the stubborn refusal to give up. Even when the lights go out. Even when the troops arrive, even when the president himself is the threat, you keep fighting. You keep showing up, and you prove one more time that power belongs to the people, not to the person in the palace, not to the army, to the people. That's the lesson of South Korea's secret coup. And it's a lesson the world needs to remember.